So first off, thank you everyone who's able to join us today for our little town hall that we have on the Omicron variant and what's going on with that. So my name is Ricky Ashby. I'm a MD PhD student at the University of Florida. I graduated with my master's in public health back in 2016. And one of my clinical mentors today, Dr. Frederick Southwick, is a board certified infectious disease specialist and has had decades of publications in the field of infectious disease and continues to contribute as a UF faculty and current practicing physician. So we're a part of the Bright Care Alliance, which is essentially a collaboration of medical professionals as well as patients and various other stakeholders in the healthcare system who are trying to advocate for evidence-based changes to essentially promote proper patient advocacy and patient rights. And if anyone has any questions about that, we'd be happy to take them up after the recording. But for now, we're going to be addressing a lot of questions that people have, and we'll be answering them to the best of our ability based off what we have. And if we go to the next slide, so we can get to what many of you already know, but some may not, the origins of the Omicron variant, which is out of South Africa. So although it was first detected in South Africa, it's believed that this has been an ongoing evolution that's been throughout Africa. But South Africa happens to have really great surveillance. That's probably one of the reasons why it was detected there first. There's a lot of theories as to what caused it to mutate to the degree that it was. Some theories include, the replication rate in immune-compromised individuals who are HIV infected may be higher. And there are also a lot of individuals, a lot of populations in Africa that unfortunately have not had the ability to get vaccinated yet. So there's a lot of things that are currently being investigated in terms of how this variant got to evolve so fast. And where we are right now is about almost 2 years into the pandemic. So you can see all the different surges we've had and the general shape and the trend that they have. The first few strains that we had, which were later named Alpha and Beta, they kind of competed with one another, and then came along Delta, and that overtook all of the others very, very quickly because its R0 value was extremely high. When I say R0, I'm saying the transmission rate. And as you can see with Omicron, you don't really see any rounding with that increase. It's extremely steep, which should concern us because that is usually an indicator of where it's going to peak. Its doubling time has been predicted to be as small as 1.5 days nowadays. So if we go to the next, and this is in South Africa, by the way, this data. If we go to the next slide, we can see that local transmission is already happening in multiple countries around the world, including the United States, Canada, Australia, India, and Europe. And in many other countries, there have also been Omicron infections detected in travelers. So we don't know how this will change in the future, but one thing is for sure that local transmission is already taking place in the United States. And this is from the CDC that shows how many cases they've identified so far. And the new US cases are very quickly becoming mostly Omicron. So we expect that Omicron is very quickly and very rapidly become the dominant strain in the United States, just based off the initial data that's going on. And here in Florida, there are already confirmed cases. And just to give an idea that this is going to happen in the United States, most likely. We have some data that we were able to get from Massachusetts that just kind of shows the projections of where this is going. These spikes, this very exponential growth that we're seeing, the transmission rate, is likely going to happen in the US, just like it did in South Africa. This is an example of what it looks like in Massachusetts. Essentially looks very similar to those previous graphs that are just showing very rapid growth that indicates just how infectious this virus really is.
Great, Ricky. So the question is, why is this virus so much more infectious? And in order to understand that, we really have to understand a little bit about the virus itself and how it works. And first of all, you've all heard now of the spike protein. That's the little red knobs, also some knobs, and they bind to host cell, bronchial epithelial cell ACE2 receptors. and they bind with high affinity to these human cells. Once they bind, the virus quickly enters into the cytoplasm of the cell, where it has a replicase that starts reproducing the RNA, and that RNA, actually part of it transcribes to proteins for the virus and continues to replicate the RNA itself of the virus. And then it combines the RNA in the nucleosomes with the proteins from the endoplasmic reticulum. It forms into a vesicle, and then it's excreted out of the cell and produces intact viral particles that then are capable of spreading to other cells, as well as populating your saliva and sputum. The original virus took 10 hours from start to finish, and usually produced 100 virions per cell. But then came along the Delta variant, which was what we're dealing with right now, and is still dominant in the United States, but not for much longer. And that variant had some mutations actually in the binding site of the spike protein, and this T478K increases affinity for the ACE2 receptors. And the P681 mutation actually affected a furin cleavage site. In order for the virus to enter, it must be cleaved at the furin site. And if you can cut that virus more quickly, it gets that site more quickly, it gets into the cell more rapidly. The consequence was that rather than the original wild type infected 2 to 2.5 people for one individual infected, the Delta variant was 5 to 8 individuals, and 70 to 80% of household contacts are being infected. And usually that occurs within 5 days. And it should be kept in mind in all countries, 80 to 85% of all infections are contracted in the household in family clusters. Now, what about the Omicron? Well, guess what? Rather than 9 mutations, there are 50 mutations, 36 of which are in the spike protein. And this is an image from the NIH Vaccine Center showing the multiple sites. And it's twice as efficient at spreading as Delta. And as a consequence, it has a very high reproductive rate, which I'll show you. But let's look at these mutations a little bit more. Here in the binding site, remember that's where the ACE2 binds to the ACE2 receptors. Look at all the orange mutations in the Omicron. Virtually every single site is mutated, and it seems to have gained a tremendous advantage. And look at the furin cleavage site, which I told you is important. It has 4 mutations in that particular site. So this is really a super virus. And what does that mean? It means it binds the ACE2 receptors even stronger than the Delta. It enters cells more rapidly and efficiently, 70% more rapidly and more efficiently than the Delta. And finally, down at the bottom, the number of viral particles compared to the wild type, 7,000 more viral particles per cell. So the concentrations are tremendous in the saliva. So what does that mean? That means it spreads. The reproductive rate is 10 to 16. One person can infect 10 to 16 people. So if an infected person walks into the room, you're highly likely to be infected. And in households, it's highly likely almost 100% of those in the household will become infected. Now, let's look at what happens at first. In the first period of time, it's asymptomatic, the first 24, 48 hours. And there it's concentrating in the nasal pharynx. And unfortunately, because of the high concentration, 7,000 times higher than the original virus. The good news is it does grow in the bronchoepithelial cells, but it looks like preliminary evidence shows that there are lower growth rates in alveolar cells, cells within the lung itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But what this tells us is that you are going to spread by droplets and aerosol. And when it turns out that Delta and the Omicron, they spread predominantly by aerosol. That is very small particles, less than 5 to 10 microns, that stay in the surface out in the air for 3 to 4 hours and can migrate and fill a room, so that if you walk into, if someone has been sitting in a room for a prolonged period of time and you walk in, you will inhale that aerosol and you will become infected. So aerosol is a major, major way that this virus spreads. So what that means from a face mask standpoint is the cloth masks are virtually useless. Throw them out. The surgical masks are somewhat effective, but really the key is an N95 or a KN95 mask, which fits tightly around the face and has very tight pores to block the virus from you breathing it in. And the other key is ventilation, and outdoors. This is an indoor virus. Whenever you can, gather with people outdoors. The small rooms, bars and restaurants, gyms, very dangerous unless there's very high airflow. So that be careful of any closed public space. Now, what about the vaccine? We've heard a lot about the vaccines. How do they work? Well, we know that what they do is they bind, all the vaccines are directed against the spike protein, and they bind the knobs. They bind the spike proteins and block them from binding the ACE2 receptors. And so the vaccines see this part of the virus, the antigenic, and that's what they bind to. As you can see, there are multiple mutations in the antigen recognition site. So what does that translate to as far as the efficacy of the vaccines? Unfortunately, when it comes to J&J and AstraZeneca, which we don't have in this country, it does not protect at all. Zero protection from 2 doses of the AstraZeneca or 1 dose of the J&J. If you get a booster, you can increase, and this is this is Omicron as compared to Delta. You see there was some protection. Omicron, this is 0 right here, and it's basically no protection unless you get a booster. And if you get a booster, you get about a 75% efficacy. What about the Pfizer and Moderna is virtually identical. You can see that the Omicron also reduces efficacy to about 33%. If you get a third shot, we've been calling it the booster, then you improve the efficacy to about 75%. It's important to keep in mind that the studies do indicate that even if you've only gotten the 2 shots, you were protected from getting an infection, only 33%, but you have a 70% protection against hospitalization. If you get the booster, it's likely to be 100%. So we need masks, we need ventilation, we need to avoid large numbers of people, and most important, we need to all be vaccinated. Now, what do we know about illness severity? There's been a lot of talk about this. We know it grows more rapidly in the bronchial epithelial cells. That's why it's so infectious and gets into the saliva in high concentrations. A little lower growth rate in one preliminary study in the pulmonary cells deep in the lung, and that would suggest maybe a little less severity. The preliminary data suggests that the hospitalization rate is 35% as compared to the other variants, and reduces the rate of MICU admission down to 20%. In other words, a reduction of 80%. Now, these are only possible outcomes. Some in Great Britain, they're claiming it's equally as virulent. So we're hoping that it's less virulent. We really aren't sure. Now, what's going to happen in Florida? Well, I think today, if you saw the headlines in the Gainesville Sun and the front page, the EPI, Emerging Pathogen Institute, Ira Longini, Tom Hladish, and Alex Pele have put together a simulation of what they think would happen, knowing the reproductive rate, knowing this, they're assuming, and they've been assuming a lower severity of illness. They come up with, first of all, there will be in mid-February, and actually I just talked to Ira Longini 20 minutes ago, he thinks it's going to be earlier. It's actually progressing more rapidly than they predicted. So it might be mid-January, but anyway, there is going to be a big peak of approximately 30,000 cases per day. That's per day. So that will accumulate to really millions of cases very quickly. And that's the number diagnosed. The number that are actually infected, because a number of people won't get the test and won't get it reported, he estimates 150,000 per day at peak. And as far as deaths go, the estimate is for the good case scenarios is 100 deaths per day. So what does that mean to our health system? Well, 100 deaths per day, and he estimates in some scenarios 600 per day, and it could even be higher. But if we know that in most medical intensive care units, the mortality of COVID-19, if you're in the MICU, is about 20%. That's a conservative estimate. That would mean if we have 100 deaths per day, that would mean 500 MICU admissions per day. We know that MICU, the average duration in the MICU is 10 days. That means at peak, at the most conservative estimate, 5,000 MICU beds will be occupied per day. That is 80% of all the ICU beds in the state of Florida, which has 6,195. If we say 200, 300, or 400, we will outstrip our MICU capacity by 3 to 4-fold. So to conclude, then, the Omicron is one of the most infectious agents ever. It's more rapid growth in cells and higher concentration of saliva. I explain this rapid transmission, and it's transmitted by aerosol, fine particles that stay in the air for prolonged periods. Therefore, air filtration and ventilation would be critical, including N95 and K95 masks. Full vaccination now equals 3 shots, not 2. And with 2 shots, you only get minimal protection. With the present COVID-19 friendly policies in Florida, Florida's health system will be overwhelmed by late January to mid-February. So the time to act is now, and that's why we're presenting this data. So I would submit to you, this is World War III. And the enemy is the Omicron variant and the Delta variant, COVID-19. And I encourage everyone to join the battle and get 3 shots. So with that, we're going to entertain questions. And I have to tell you, the number of questions has been pretty much overwhelming. We've had over 40 questions. So I thought we'll start with an area that we did not cover, and that is testing. So this was the first question. If you think you might be exposed to COVID, what's the best testing strategy? At-home tests, rapid tests, PCR? How long should we wait after exposure for most accurate results? Well, this is an excellent question. And I didn't get into it, but the incubation period is shorter than the other viruses, 1.5 to 3 days. So you can get the test fairly quickly. And the question is, what test? And that's a fairly complicated answer. And so I put together some slides. First of all, the PCR test. That usually takes 24 hours turnaround. Because the virus spreads so quickly, it's almost too late to get a PCR test. But if you get a PCR test, generally there are probes to multiple sites in a PCR, usually 3 probes, one to the RNA nuclear capsid, one to the spike protein, and usually one to another region. It turns out that one of the PCRs, the Fisher PCR, its probe for the spike protein is not recognized on the Omicron. Therefore, PCR can actually give you the diagnosis of Omicron versus others. Although it's moving so fast, I think within about a week or 2 more, every test will be, you can assume that every positive test is Omicron. But the problem is it takes a long time, and you've got to go to a site to get the nasal swabs. This is not done at home. Now, the rapid antigen tests, what they do is they have a specific antibody, most of the time to the nuclear capsid region, and therefore they are sensitive to the Omicron. They take 15 minutes. It's the same principle as a pregnancy test, only if you see the second red bar, there's a black bar, that's the control. If the red bar turns red, you see that red bar, then you've got the virus. Now, the problem is we can't get them right now. There is a extreme shortage and they're relatively expensive. 25, I just bought two sets myself. They were $24 for two each. So this is a lot of expense. So it is, and right now we don't have them. We're hoping they'll be present in short order, but that would be, if I were screening, I would use the rapid antigen test. And I just want to go over, and here just shows you that the rapid antigen test, which would be in red, and the live virus, actually, if this is time of exposure right here, you can see that it's almost as good as sensitive as the PCR, not quite as much, but with the high concentrations of the Omicron in the nasal passage, it's likely it will be almost equally sensitive. Now, if you can, you see the PCR can persist for long periods, so we don't use it to determine the carrier state. Now, I wanted to propose another approach, and we just submitted a paper about this, and that is monitoring your temperature daily, ideally in the morning and evening, electronically or with any thermometer, and an oral temperature is probably preferable. And what you want to do is determine what your basal level is. Most people, it's supposed to be 98.5. I happen to know myself, I'm 97.4. So, and you monitor, and if your temperature goes up 1 degree centigrade or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, then that defines a fever. And we have found that using those approaches, saying if your temperature is 100.8, or if you're 38 degrees centigrade or 37.6 degrees centigrade, you have or fever 100.4 versus 38, you have fever. Or if you go up 1 degree centigrade or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, you have fever. And that has a 73% sensitivity if you monitor for 3 days, carefully for 3 days. That's the same as PCR and the same as antigen testing. It's not as specific. So you can also determine if you have symptoms. That increases the specificity, increases the likelihood it is COVID-19. And we actually did, it's called a testing looking at multiple factors, determine what the risk is if you have fever combined with another symptom. If you have fever and chills, you have a 3.5-fold higher risk that you have COVID. If you have fever and loss of taste and smell, 10 times likelihood. So that means you have it. Fever and cough increases by 3.5. Fever and fatigue, a higher likelihood. Fever and stuffy nose and fever and cough all increase the likelihood. And if you can't get a test, you can assume that you have COVID-19. So here, I'm not going to go through the whole algorithm, but there's a very simple algorithm to determine, do I have a fever? Yes. Do I have symptoms? Yes. If I have one of these specific symptoms, I can assume I have COVID-19. If I have fever, but no symptoms, then I need to get a rapid antigen test. If I don't have fever, then it's highly unlikely that you do have this disease. So that just goes over. So there is an inexpensive way actually to deal without doing testing if you follow your temperature closely. But if you can, the rapid antigen test would be the test of choice. Now, someone said that my antigen test is going to expire in the beginning of January. Does that mean the test won't work? I suspect it'll probably work to February or March, but this test does use an antibody, and those antibodies can decay over time, so it may become less sensitive. The problem is we're hoping, and President Biden just said yesterday, the government is going to supply these antigen tests through a website and will supply everyone. We'll see. This is a tremendous, difficult supply chain challenge, and I'm not sure that they're going to be able to overcome this quickly. What are the options in Alachua County for testing COVID? I actually emailed Paul Myers, and I don't know at this point what they are, but I think we need to keep an eye on the Alachua County Public Health Department website. is a rapid antigen test or rapid or antigen test. I'm not sure if what rapid diagnostic means. PCR probably more accurate. The PCR is more accurate, but not by much. It is a little bit more sensitive because it picks up lower concentration of virus, but it takes much longer. And because this spreads so quickly, a day, 24 hours can make the difference between everybody getting infected or being protected. Treatment. We haven't talked at all about treatment, but guess what happened today? There was an emergency use approval for the Pfizer vaccine. And let me just show you. So this is called proxolovid, and it is actually a combination of antiviral RNA, which actually blocks a protease. It's important for replication of the virus. And it's combined with another drug called ritonavir. It prevents hospitalization by 90%. And actually in their trial, there were no deaths. You have to start it within the first 5 days. It's 3 tablets taken together twice per day for 5 days. Now that the EUA is released, hopefully this will be getting this drug very shortly. And I think it's a very, very important development that could definitely save lives. What about monoclonal antibodies? The Regeneron does not work against Omicron. There's one monoclonal that does, but my understanding is it's back ordered. So their monoclonal antibodies will not be effective. And thank goodness for the new Pfizer drug. So then what about vaccines and immunity? How long does it take for full protection from a booster? How long will immunity last? I got my booster shot September 1st, 2021. Do we need another booster around January 2022? The booster, we really do not have an answer for that. Ricky, I don't know if you want to comment on this. I'm taking up all the limelight here.
Sorry, what was the question one more time?
Well, how long do you think the boosters are going to last?
So that's something, unfortunately, I can't answer just because we don't have any data on it. So it is a very good question, and I haven't seen anything that really gives a clear timeline on that. I think there just hasn't been enough filling of those trials yet for us to get a definitive answer.
Yeah, one of the good things is within 7 days of receiving the booster, you actually peak your antibody production, your neutralizing antibodies. So it will act when you get that booster, you can be protected quickly. That's why we want everyone to get the booster. Will natural immunity from those who had SARS-CoV-2 help against Omicron? Ricky, you want to answer that?
Sorry, on mute. So natural immunity, unfortunately, is very different from person to person. So to say that natural immunity is going to give immunization to something, the natural immunity that's developed by one person is not necessarily equal to that of another. So a vaccine is way more effective overall, and also gives us kind of a standardized dose so that it's, there's still going to be variation from person to person, but there's going to be less variation, if that makes sense. So natural immunity will not really help against Omicron. There's already been numerous reinfections that have happened, not only with Omicron, but all the previous strains as well. We've seen repeated reinfection of new variants. So natural immunity just really isn't effective for coronavirus in general. That's part of why we need new vaccines to come out, which Pfizer is already working on one. And there was recently some data that came in about the SPFN vaccine, which is going to be a multivalent vaccine that is very promising. It's being done by the U.S. Army. So hopefully in the future, those vaccines will be able to solve all of these issues because, like I said, natural immunity just doesn't cut it, unfortunately.
And someone asked about guidelines for grandparents of children who are too young to be vaccinated. Our recommendation is you cannot see those grandchildren during this period. It is far too dangerous. Even with a booster, we are not sure if you are to become exposed to someone that's unvaccinated, the concentrations of virus in the nasal passage could be very high. They have not studied children as to the levels of virus in their sputum or their saliva. So we don't know, but I think at this point, until we have a lot more knowledge, I'm afraid that grandparents should not see children that are not vaccinated. And I was boosted at the end of August. Does that mean I am more vulnerable since I am almost 4 months out of my booster? That was what Ricky just mentioned. We just mentioned that the duration of booster benefit and protection is not known. What people are looking at is the neutralizing antibody. So you take the serum from someone who is boosted and then look to see how diluted it can be before it is killed, how dilute before it stops killing the virus. We're only really haven't been that many studies of the booster. And in fact, there haven't been very many at all with someone with a booster for that long, and whether or not the neutralizing antibodies are protective. So we do not have an answer. At this point, I think you probably are protected. And remember, the serum antibody production, that's a surrogate marker. The T cell function is most important for killing this virus. And we suspect T cell immunity will persist for very prolonged times as far as protecting from serious disease. But remember, as you get older, your T cells don't function as well, and therefore you are at greater risk. Are we going to be free from COVID and its variants? Ricky, you want to take a stab at that, and then I'll weigh in.
So I'm a bit more optimistic. So there are a lot of reasons why the COVID, just in general, the coronaviruses aren't going to go away. There have been a number of coronavirus epidemics that many people haven't heard of, like the MERS and the original SARS that came out. This one just happened to have such mutations that it was extremely infective, and it just so happened to get out at just the right time when everyone was traveling, and it was just a lot of bad things happened. And they're doing a lot of research right now, investigations into the origins and all that. That's a whole separate topic. But the key thing is that it came from animals for the most part. And so they've already detected it in a number of different species around the world. So it's really difficult to imagine that it's going to be completely gone. But in terms of keeping it under control in humans, once we start to get a better multivalent vaccine, like I said, the Army vaccine, no promises on that, but a lot of the initial data seems to show that it could pave the way of give us a new platform for having a universal coronavirus vaccine. So a lot of people are looking forward to that. So it's one of those things where we'll just have to wait and see. But in general, I am optimistic that we can keep the transmission in humans manageable as long as more people are able to get vaccinated. That's the key thing. Is it's difficult to imagine an ability to do that without vaccines. Everyone getting a vaccine. Yeah,
I agree. The vaccine is the key to everything, and how and why it became politicized, I just don't understand it. I questioned Republican legislators. Do you really want all your voters to die? I mean, it doesn't make sense. Why the virus does not differentiate between a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. Anyone that does not follow infection control practices, does not get vaccinated, are at risk of dying, period. So the vaccine is critical for reducing, increasing herd immunity and getting to the point where the reproductive rate drops below zero, or below 1. If we can do that, if we can achieve that. So if you have friends that aren't getting vaccinated, I think renew your conversations. It is really, as never before, it is really important to get vaccinated. And we also need to vaccinate the rest of the world. Obviously, South Africa at the time had less than 30% who had received the vaccine. That's why this particular variant took over. So we really are only as strong as our weakest link. So one possibility is that this virus is so infectious, it could theoretically infect the entire world so quickly that we all might achieve immunity, at least temporarily, from this virus. But it will be at the cost of millions of lives. So what is going to take to get people who aren't vaccinated to get the vaccines and the boosters? Well, the evidence is that no advertisement, no educational program will change people's mind. Really, one of the best ways that's been most effective is to require vaccination to go to public spaces, because if you're unvaccinated, you go to that public space, you endanger everyone else. Is that fair? And to require the vaccine in our schools, just as the meningococcal vaccine, the measles vaccine, and the Hib vaccine, and many other vaccines. This is just straightforward and logical. Unfortunately, because of the politics, right now, you cannot require, they of course call it a mandate and call it personal freedom. I think that is really an inappropriate use of the word freedom. Freedom to infect your fellow man, I don't think so, but that's where we are. And until we can get everyone to speak with the same voice and follow the science, we're really in trouble. And so the only way now is individual one-on-one conversations with friends. And even that, unfortunately, I found is not always effective. A friend of mine had a booster shot and got sick for 3 days, and I don't want that to happen to me. Well, the boosters can give you temporary fatigue, low-grade fevers, muscle aches. However, in virtually every single case, it resolves within 72 hours. We know that the Omicron can, and there have actually been there have been 7 or 8 deaths reported now in Great Britain, and there will be many more. We know that the virus can kill you. There have been virtually no cases directly attributable. There are very super rare cases attributable to the vaccine causing death. And if they were to be one, it would be a severe allergic reaction, an anaphylactic reaction. And we know with the 2 mRNA vaccines that is somewhere between 2 and 4 anaphylactic reactions per million doses. So this is among the most safest vaccines ever. And you will keep hearing these urban legends about somebody dying from the vaccine. It simply is not true. So a common thought I've heard from people who are opposed to getting the vaccine boosters, the Omicron variant is less deadly and will only mimic flu, common cold. Can you please expand on this? Ricky, you want to comment on this first?
Yeah, sure. I believe there was someone who sent a direct message on chat. So I'll just use the same analogy. So I've heard people compare the coronavirus to the common cold since this began. And they are, there are some coronaviruses in the coronavirus family that do cause the common cold. This is not one of those, though. It's basically like comparing a house cat to a tiger. Like, sure, they're both technically a little bit related, but one you would let in your living room. The other one, could potentially kill you, if that makes sense. So the Omicron variant is definitely a lot deadlier than the common cold, profoundly more deadly.
I agree. The Delta may be a little bit more deadly, but this Omicron is so much more infectious, as I did in my simulation, even though there's a lower mortality, because there's so many cases that are going to occur, the actual result, the number of deaths could be very, very high. The percentage of people who die would be lower, but the number of deaths will be very, very high. Remember, the Vietnam War, there were about 57,000 people died. In Florida, we're over 60,000 deaths from COVID-19. How many more deaths does it take before we all wake up? And we're headed for another big surge in illness and death. And the only way to really stop it is the vaccine at this point. I also heard from a handful of people in their early and mid 20s, they don't need to get the vaccine booster because they are more susceptible, because those who are more susceptible are already vaccinated. Additionally, they feel healthy 20ers, will only feel light symptoms since they are young and healthy. Well, I think Ricky actually pointed this. Yes, you're less likely, but given the number of people that are going to become infected, people in their 20s and 30s will die, just as they have died from the Delta variant, just as they've died from the Alpha variant. It won't be as many, but one death in a 20-year-old is too many. Unfortunately, the young feel invulnerable. That's a great feeling, but you aren't when it comes to the COVID-19, whether it's Omicron, Delta, Alpha, you are at risk of serious disease and being hospitalized and dying.
Yeah, there's also
yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say there's also the long COVID symptoms as well. So that's definitely something to worry about. I've definitely met people in their 20s who have lost their taste of sense of taste and sense of smell completely, and it just never came back.
Yeah, and the long there was a question later on about long COVID. Long COVID, it can be very, very serious, and people have been debilitated so far for over a year with chronic fatigue, brain fog, muscle aches, weakness, chronic pain. So it's a real syndrome, and young people can definitely get that. So who wants to have their college career or their young life destroyed by chronic fatigue and pain? I wouldn't want that. How effective are two BioNTech Pfizer vaccines and the third Moderna booster against and a third Moderna booster against SARS-CoV-2 and the recent Delta and Omicron variants for seniors 60 to 80 years old as a group in Florida? It looks like it seems all age groups do respond to 3 doses of, you could have 3 doses of the Pfizer, 3 doses of the Moderna, 2 doses of the Pfizer and 1 dose of the Moderna. They all seem to, even in older patients, we are getting a very good response. So we would encourage everyone, including those over 60, and everybody should get the 3rd shot. And it's likely you will be protected. But again, we will know more over the ensuing weeks whether or not you are totally protected. We can't say for sure. If someone gets the Omicron variant, will it provide protection from the Delta variant or lessen its severity? Ricky, you want to comment on that?
So I would be hesitant to say that, just because if basically, we saw that there's a lot of mutations happening on the antigenic region, right? So if it goes one way, that immunity to one does not necessarily give full immunity to the other, I would imagine the vice versa is also true. So if you're immune to Omicron, it's pretty likely that you might still be susceptible to Delta as well. In the same way that, unless you get vaccinated, it's difficult to really get your immune system primed so well that it's able to still bind to the different spike protein, if that makes sense. Because not all the spike proteins are going to look the same. You're going to have the Delta spike protein, you're going to have the Omicron spike protein. Your immune system will learn how to fight off one, but that, everyone's antibodies are going to be a little bit different too. So it's kind of, in the vaccine, we have, the spike proteins that are, injected, and then that primes your immune system to make antibodies to it. But your antibodies may be to a different region on the spike protein than mine. So this is why there's a lot of variation between people. And hopefully this will change now that they're starting to make vaccines that are specific to these variants. Like, for example, Omicron. Pfizer's already planning on coming out with one that's specific to Omicron. I'm not sure the status on that, but they announced it a few weeks back, a 100-day plan. So that should probably come out maybe around February or March. And like I said, the Army nanoparticle vaccine is also going to help provide new platforms to that. So I'm hoping that will kind of overcome this issue, so they can just vaccinate you for all of them all at once.
The basic take home is, though, except if you end up in the intensive care unit on a respirator, the degree of immunity conferred by an infection is going to be less effective than the vaccine. So vaccine is always preferable over infection. And the good news is you don't end up in the ICU. Though fully vaccinated for all 3, I'm currently COVID positive, experiencing symptoms. How likely am I to get COVID again? It's because of the changes in the continued mutations. We can't say, but I would predict that your symptoms will be relatively short-lived. And what we're finding is those that are vaccinated and get infected, they are carriers for shorter periods of time. And now we're rethinking, for instance, in the hospital, we're quite sure many of the healthcare professionals will, as they care for these patients with Omicron, probably will be get them infected. And the hope is that we can keep, they only will have to stay out for 4, 5, 6 days, because then they will no longer be infectious because they were vaccinated. But and that is being studied as we speak. But you might still be able to get an infection. It should be mild and it shouldn't last very long. Let me see here. Okay, there are a lot of questions on gatherings and events. Should we not attend Christmas gatherings since not all are vaccinated? My son-in-law and granddaughter and brother-in-law aren't vaccinated. Well, if you have, I would not recommend that unvaccinated people gather with those that are vaccinated. We know that the unvaccinated are going to have higher concentrations than nasal passage and can infect those that are vaccinated. The approach now and should be is that you need to get a antigen test about no earlier than 48 hours or no later than 48 hours before the event, preferably 24 hours before the event, because this virus has such a short incubation period. If you go out, it's 3 days, you do a test, you could pick it up and become infectious by the time you arrive at the family gathering. So you need a test within 24 to 48 hours of that event. And I think the risk still of missing is great enough that I would not recommend joining with anybody that isn't vaccinated. Ricky, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the key takeaway is just the best thing to do is to just avoid big gatherings, because whether you're vaccinated or not, there's still a risk of spreading Omicron in this case, because Omicron is extremely, the R naught value, if you guys remember from the slides, it's astronomically higher. There's a lot more aerosolization of this virus. And that's actually what concerns me, because that makes it extremely difficult to avoid transmitting it.
Yeah.
And as I think the statistics speak for themselves, that pretty much 90% to 100% of the households, if someone gets it, is going to get infected eventually. So, yeah.
Good. Yeah. How safe is it attending church with where they are singing without in a choir without a mask? Makes me nervous. Can you do another seminar on church safety? I think we may need to have one. Singing is the most effective way to aerosolize. There could be no worse activity than singing without masks. In our church, we're going to stop the singing in choirs. If you want 1 or 2 people singing, then they need to be tested, as I mentioned, 24 hours before, and they need to be fully vaccinated, both those things, to consider singing at all. It is a large site. I think the risk of spread is so high now that I am fearful of any church gatherings, although I understand the need for physical contact or personal contact. And so I think the risks are going to be measured. I am fearful that they're going to be too high, and then most people will feel it's too dangerous to join church. But if you are fully vaccinated, you're likely to only get a mild illness if you really want to go to church. But I think it's really a difficult question, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but any large gathering, as Ricky said, is very dangerous at this time. How can we keep the Christmas Eve worship services? How can we keep them from becoming super spreader events? I'm hoping that the Omicron has only been a few cases so far in Alachua County, so I think we might be okay. It may not have hit. I think it's not going to hit before Christmas Eve, so I think we're still with the less infectious agents. So probably if you wear a mask the whole time, if you get an N95, you're probably safe. And I doubt if there'll be super spreader events that early. In the next week after that, I think you would be at risk. Yeah, travel safety is going to be a problem. And exactly when, one of the things is because this is such a high reproductive rate, it'd probably be even more violent surge, more extreme surge than the Delta, and should actually burn itself out more quickly. The hope was by spring, everybody that could have become infected will have become infected, and that everybody else will be highly vaccinated, and that you shouldn't continue to spread. But that's just a guess. Going indoors restaurants where all my group are vaccinated and boosted, servers masked, but of course you can't keep a mask on a meal. Should this be completely avoided? The answer is yes. No indoor dining. Absolutely contraindicated at this point. I have been fearful of that even prior to that, and only have eaten outdoors. Outdoors is probably reasonably safe, although with this one, I don't know yet. There may be cases even contracted if you're eating outdoors. I don't know that at this point. I'm very leery even of that. If positive but asymptomatic person does not wear a mask in public, like at a grocery store where they're breathing out and touching inventory, how much risk of infection does that present for people who are masked and bolstered, and can that risk be minimized? If you're going to the grocery store and you're vaccinated, wear a KN95 mask. The other key thing is make your grocery shopping as quick as possible. The longer you are in a site where there is someone who is spewing out the virus because they're not vaccinated, the higher the risk to you. There will be risk, but if you can be quick, you can wear a NK95 mask, you're probably going to be okay. But unfortunately, every public area where people without masks are showing is extremely dangerous. Ricky, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the key thing I would say is that the aerosols that are going through the air are the key thing to worry about. In terms of aerosols landing on something and then transmitting that way, you can always just wash your hands, just try to not touch your face and stuff. But the primary mode of transmission of this virus is through aerosols. Like someone breathes out, all those aerosols that are able to go through most masks, except for N95s, for example. And that's usually how transmission happens. So,
right, and actually, as far as fomites, that is infectious particles on the ground or surface in dust, or on the ground, this virus is not hardy. It doesn't survive well at all on surfaces. It seems to die almost immediately. So you don't have to be that paranoid about cleaning surfaces. Yes, don't touch surfaces and then rub your eye. But if you wash your hands, that should be more than sufficient. And I've still been on the lookout for one case spread by fomites. I have not found one yet. What can be done to ensure UF students are afforded the option to attend classes and seminars remotely? How can we advocate for a universal hybrid option that can stem the spread, which will likely be a major peak in local transmission? We've got a real problem. The governor is very COVID friendly, and he is demanding in-person classes and doesn't want remote. It's a very, very difficult situation when a person in authority does not accept the science. And I don't have a good answer. I think this UF student should demand that during it, certainly, I would say for the January and mid-February, that the virtual classes would be a heck of a lot safer. Ricky, any thoughts on that?
I think the key thing is to just speak up about it. There should be, to my understanding, I'm not enrolled in any classes this semester, but I think most classes are offered, even the ones that are in person, some kind of a remote option. I think all of them still offer that. Didn't it require?
I hope so. Yeah, that should be the way. It should be hybrid. If you want to take a chance, go ahead. But if I were a student, I would do virtual for a while.
Yeah. If they have the option, then you go. If they don't have the option for your class, I would just, make sure to illustrate to the administration that you would really like that option.
Now that mask mandates in Alachua County schools are illegal, I've encouraged my granddaughter to continue wearing hers, even though she has been vaccinated, because that seems prudent. Is it? I'm concerned the state of Florida is headed for deep trouble with the variant. I could not agree more with that statement. And that's one of the reasons we're making this presentation. And if she, unfortunately, a regular mask that's not an N95 won't help her that much. And wow, it's really hard to wear an N95 mask all day. I do it whenever I'm in the hospital. I have never used anything but an N95 since this pandemic started. But she probably needs a KN95 if she's going to do that to afford significant protection. But it's just really embarrassing that we have legislators that are making it illegal to do the right thing. I can't believe it, but that's the way it is. When should you mask if we're fully vaccinated and boosted? Any public closed space. Anything else, Ricky, you think on that?
Yeah, so just whenever you're in public, wear a mask, definitely. Does vaccination status doesn't matter. Honestly, this is just my opinion, but I think that the CDC jumped the gun way too fast on the whole, letting people who are vaccinated, not wear a mask. I don't think that ever really should have happened. And if you actually look at, polls of epidemiologists, 90% of epidemiologists disagreed with that decision. That's a whole separate thing, but the whole idea that if you're vaccinated, you don't need to wear a mask anymore, I think is not really backed by much science. Especially now, it's quite antithetical to the science these days with the new variants.
There's no question that the Omicron is creating breakthroughs about 3 to 4 times more frequently than the Delta did. So you are really susceptible, unfortunately, particularly if you come across someone who is unvaccinated. And the next question is, I don't think there's more to add to than what we've already said. I think the key is to avoid public spaces whenever possible. That's the only solution. And the other thing that I mentioned in one of my slides is if high ventilation, if you can really get outside air in, that's very helpful. And if you can gather outside, that's the safest. Okay, transmission as of Omicron been detected in Gainesville. As far as I know, I tried to get up-to-date data. There have been 1 or 2, but only 1 or 2 so far. But it's probably going to be, I would say within the next week will be more, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, I'd be very careful because a lot of people are going to be leaving for the holidays and then coming back. So especially since this is going to be spreading across the United States, the chance that we're going to be without Omicron for much longer is pretty low.
Thoughts on conflicting information. I hear the exposure to this variant will be unavoidable, but vaccine status could make the difference in recovery time. That's pretty much correct. Although I think with an N95, and if you're minimize your public space exposure, and you're vaccinated, you could avoid it. I think you can avoid it. Ricky, any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Good.
That's pretty much it.
What's the best projection with situation? Well, I showed you the projections. Possibly by March, it may be burned out. We don't know yet. It really depends on a lot of things. It depends on if more people get vaccinated. And it depends on whether everybody is gathering and ignores the concerns about public spaces, how fast this peaks, and how fast it comes under control. Yeah, as I mentioned, my strategy is to avoid public events and spaces at this point. And anywhere I go out in the public, I'm wearing an N95 mask, and we're all boosted.
Yeah, the key thing is to get a booster, wear a mask, and just the general precautions. And it's important to realize that I hope no one misconstrues. So 75% effective, that's great, but it's not 100%. So even if you have all of the boosters and you're wearing a mask all the time, it's still possible to get infected. It's just the idea is that we're going to reduce the amounts of people who wind up getting critically sick. We also reduce the amount of spread that's happening in the community to such a point that we can manage all of the patients, that we have enough monoclonal antibody to treat the patients who get really sick. And we're not overwhelming our healthcare system, and we don't have a bunch of unnecessary deaths. That's the key point.
Well, yeah, and let's hope the Pfizer antiviral is distributed quickly. The concept is the following. I showed you the Swiss cheese model. One intervention is not enough. You need all of those. You need to apply all of the protective steps at the same time. You can't, one is not going to do it. So that's the problem. Oh, well, this one doesn't work. That one doesn't work. They all work, but they aren't 100%. They're all on the 30, 40%. But if you combine things that are 30 to 40% and you multiple 30% of, 30%, and then you take, so that gives you 70%. And then you do 30% of 70%, then you're down, you keep going. And then 30% of that, pretty soon the risk is relatively low. That's why you want to use multiple interventions at the same time. And then we talked about the long-term COVID. So we actually covered all of the questions that were in this, our formal. Now there are a lot in the chat. Ricky, do you want to read some of those off?
Yeah, I was gonna try to, did we finish all of them?
Yes.
All right, so yeah, I was actually waiting for that just because I wanted to be respectful for the people who are RSVP'd and all that, make sure that their points get addressed. So I'm just gonna start from the top. I'm gonna have to scroll back up. And so please comment on ivermectin. I would love to, because that was fraudulent, essentially. The original study, there's a lot of sketchy things that came out about it. They had retracted paper. Basically, it was just fraud. Ivermectin is not effective, unfortunately, in treatment of COVID. And I'm sorry that that information got spread around. This is why you can't just take one study that has no other experts really weighing in on it and just take that as absolute facts. Science is a very messy form of moving forward sometimes, and there needs to be peer review. By that I mean a lot of other experts in that field need to look at a study and see if they can reproduce it, see if it makes sense, and really look at it and criticize it. And unfortunately, that didn't really get to happen with that ivermectin study. And a lot of people thought that this would essentially be a silver bullet against COVID, and it's not.
Yeah, the placebo-controlled, an excellent placebo-controlled trial looked at the number of cases infected. The two lines between the sugar pill and the ivermectin superimposed. They were identical. And that couldn't happen if it would have any efficacy at all. And from a biological standpoint, there was no reason to believe that a drug that works for roundworms would work for a virus. That's idiotic. Idiotic.
And chloroquine as well. That's like a malaria drug.
Right. Like, these are pseudoscientists that are just trying to be sensational and controversial and make money through ads. It's just disgraceful.
Yeah, because this has happened before, and this happened with a guy who tried to say that autism is caused by vaccines. That got a lot of controversy. Not to go off on a tangent, but just for a second, they found out that he was working with an attorney that wanted to sue the vaccine company, and that was the whole reason why that whole entire movement got started. And so, kind of similar with the chloroquine, you can make a lot of money doing that. I mean, you just do something completely inflammatory, and you get all of the scientists all mad. You make it look like you're an iconoclast, as if you're making some big breakthrough and everyone's trying to hold you back. I don't know. People buy into that for some reason. You need to get some psychologists to do some studies on why that is. But
yeah, one of the things that's a real problem is there are facts, and then there is disinformation. Some people would call them lies. And the press says, well, there's a debate between a lie and the scientific truth. No, there is not. And it is the role of the press to identify the truth and publish it and expose the lies. And unfortunately, it hasn't been as successful as we would like it to be.
Yeah, so Frank Fusco actually posted a change.org petition that we should all sign, because apparently there are a lot of seminars that do not have virtual options. I did not know that. I mean, like, my department is very good about making sure that there are those options. So the fact that there aren't those options in some departments is actually kind of concerning to me.
So we've got about 5 more. I don't want to run over too far. 5 more minutes and we're going to end.
Yeah, we're almost at the end.
Okay.
Yeah, 2 people I know who went on ivermectin both contracted COVID and were quite ill. Unfortunately, not surprising. I think that's it. Is there evidence that the size of the inoculum impacts the severity of the disease? Yes, bigger the inoculum, the more severe the disease. That's part of why physicians and frontline workers are so at risk, and why it's so important that they get vaccinated for their own safety.
And that's another reason to wear a mask. It won't be 100% protective, but it should reduce your inoculum, and therefore your disease will be milder.
That is exactly a good question, because that's really important, because as Dr. Southwick said, even if you get COVID, COVID isn't a binary thing. It's not just like you have COVID or you don't have COVID. If you are unmasked and you're unvaccinated and you meet someone who's unvaccinated, they're going to have a big inoculum that's going to pass on to you, for example. Versus if you are vaccinated and you have a mask, you may get it, but it won't be as bad because the amount of virus that started off in your nasal passage is smaller.
Great. Well, I think that is really, I'm so impressed with the questions, the thoughtfulness of the audience, and we're all very concerned. And I sense this concern, and that's why we had this town hall meeting. And I hope you will spread the word. We will record the first 15 minutes, and I will send out a YouTube link to that so that you can share it with friends. Information, the right information, gives you power, gives you some sense of control. And this is it is a very challenging time for us all. And I think we all need to do what we can, each of us, our little step to improve the condition. And so the more people you can convince to become vaccinated, and the vaccine, remember, vaccination means 3 shots now, the more likely we are to control the virus in Florida. So, and I think, go to your legislators. Why would anybody vote for a legislator that votes against blocking control of infection? I don't understand why you would vote for a person like that. It's time to look at what they do and look at the impact that they're having on you and your society, and vote in the interest of humankind, in the interest of health, and in the interest of welfare. And that's what physicians are all concerned about, the health and welfare of you and all our patients. And we don't want to see this surge of people into the hospital again, if we can possibly help it. The key is prevention, and we still have a little time for prevention. So with that, I think we'll close. Thank you very much.